Title: The slap heard round the bank, the CEO's undisguised takeover. The humid New York air clung to Daniel Carter like a second skin as he crossed the street toward Sterling Bank. He adjusted the collar of his simple, off-the-rack suit, a deliberate choice. No Brioni, no Rolex, no chauffeured black car, just Daniel Carter, a man who looked like any other customer about to walk through those imposing glass doors. But he wasn't. He was Daniel Carter, the newly appointed CEO of Sterling Bank, a titan in the financial world. A world he had clawed his way into, inch by painful inch, from the unforgiving streets of Detroit. A world where the color of his skin often preceded his credentials. His mandate was clear: overhaul Sterling Bank. Cleanse it of the rot that festered beneath its gleaming facade. Corruption, unchecked ambition, and the insidious poison of racial prejudice. He wanted a first-hand look. He needed to see the bank, his bank, through the eyes of an ordinary customer. He needed to experience the rot for himself before wielding the scalpel. He stepped inside. The air conditioning hit him like a wall. Marble floors, polished to a blinding sheen, stretched before him. Behind the long teller counters, faces turned toward him, scrutinizing. He felt the weight of their gaze, the subtle shift in atmosphere. Sandra Hughes, the branch manager, was a statuesque woman with ice-blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes, the color of glacial ice, flicked over him, dismissing him with a micro-expression of disdain. A black man, dressed plainly, walking in alone. Definitely not worth her time. David Wallace, the assistant manager, hovered nearby, a man perpetually seeking approval. His face was pale and bland, his ambition a coiled spring ready to unleash. At the security desk, Marcus Johnson, a man built like a brick wall in a uniform too tight, watched him with a blank, unreadable expression. He was the bank's muscle, the enforcer of its unspoken rules. Only one face stood out. Alex Monroe, a young teller with intelligent, curious eyes, regarded Daniel with a flicker of something that wasn't dismissal. Maybe even suspicion. Daniel walked to an empty teller window. "I'd like to make a withdrawal," he said, his voice calm and measured. The teller, a nervous young woman with too much makeup, smiled weakly. "Of course, sir. Account number and ID, please." He provided the information. It wasn't his personal account. It was a test account, set up by his legal team. An account with a substantial balance. The woman's eyes widened slightly as she typed in the information. "And how much would you like to withdraw, sir?" $50,000, Daniel replied. The teller's jaw visibly dropped. She stammered, "50,000? That's a very large withdrawal, sir. I'll need to get authorization." She scurried away, disappearing into an office behind the tellers. Daniel waited. He could feel Sandra Hughes' gaze boring into his back. Moments later, Sandra Hughes emerged, her face a mask of carefully controlled disapproval. She approached Daniel's window. "Sir," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I'm Sandra Hughes, the branch manager. I understand you wish to withdraw $50,000. "That's correct. May I ask the purpose of this withdrawal?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Is that standard procedure for all customers withdrawing funds from their accounts?" "For withdrawals of this size, yes, it is," she lied smoothly. "We need to ensure the security of our clients' assets. I assure you, the funds are for a perfectly legitimate purpose." Sandra Hughes' smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm afraid we still need to verify your identity further. Do you have any additional identification with you?" Daniel sighed inwardly. This was exactly what he had expected. He produced a second form of ID. Sandra Hughes examined it slowly, deliberately, as if searching for a flaw. She glanced at David Wallace, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "I'm still not entirely comfortable with this," she said, handing the ID back. "I'm going to need to make a few calls." She disappeared into her office again. The tension in the bank thickened. Daniel could feel the collective gaze of the staff on him. He stood his ground, his face impassive. Alex Monroe, the young teller, watched the scene unfold with growing unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was something about this man, something that didn't quite add up. Sandra Hughes returned, her face even more hardened than before. She motioned to Marcus Johnson, the security guard. "Sir," she said, her voice sharp. "I'm going to have to ask you to step into my office. We need to discuss this matter further." "I'm perfectly comfortable discussing it here," Daniel replied, his voice calm. "I'm afraid that's not an option," Sandra Hughes said, her eyes flashing. "Marcus, please escort this gentleman to my office." Marcus Johnson moved forward, his expression grim. He placed a heavy hand on Daniel's arm. "Sir, please come with me." Daniel resisted. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm simply trying to withdraw funds from my account." "I'm asking you politely to come with me," Sandra Hughes said, her voice rising. "Otherwise, I'll have to call the police." The other customers in the bank began to stare. A murmur of apprehension rippled through the room. "This is ridiculous," Daniel said, his voice laced with anger. "I have a right to access my own money." Marcus Johnson tightened his grip on Daniel's arm. "Let's go, sir." Daniel pulled his arm away. "Don't touch me." That was the spark. Marcus Johnson grabbed Daniel from behind, twisting his arm painfully behind his back. "Don't resist," he growled. Daniel struggled, but Marcus Johnson was too strong. He forced Daniel down onto the counter, his face pressed against the cold marble. "This is assault," Daniel shouted. "He's resisting arrest." Sandra Hughes yelled, her voice shrill. The other customers gasped. Several pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Daniel continued to struggle, but he was no match for Marcus Johnson. He felt a sharp pain in his shoulder. "I demand you release me," he shouted. Sandra Hughes approached, her face flushed with anger. She raised her hand, and then she slapped him. The sound echoed through the bank. A collective gasp filled the air. Daniel's head snapped to the side. He felt the sting of the blow, the humiliation washing over him. "You have no right to give orders here." Sandra Hughes screamed. The world seemed to slow down. Daniel lay pinned against the counter, the taste of blood in his mouth, the echo of the slap still ringing in his ears. He was stunned, not so much by the physical pain, but by the sheer audacity of it. The blatant abuse of power, the raw, unfiltered prejudice. A wave of fury surged through him, cold and controlled. He had witnessed the rot. He had felt it. Now it was time to excise it. One of the customers, a young black woman, cried out, "That's messed up. You can't just treat people like that." Others murmured their agreement, but fear kept them silent. Marcus Johnson, emboldened by Sandra Hughes's actions, tightened his grip. "Get up. You're trespassing," ignoring the pain in his shoulder. Daniel managed to speak, his voice low and dangerous. "You're making a mistake. A very big mistake," Sandra Hughes sneered. "Get him out of here. And call the police. We're pressing charges for trespassing and resisting arrest." Daniel was dragged, kicking and protesting, out of the bank and onto the sidewalk. The doors slammed shut behind him. He stood there, his suit rumpled, his face bruised, the humiliation searing his soul. A few onlookers whispered and pointed. Daniel ignored them. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and made a call. "Get the team ready," he said, his voice clipped. "It's time." 15 minutes later, a sleek, black Rolls-Royce pulled up to the curb in front of Sterling Bank. A team of impeccably dressed security personnel emerged, followed by 2 sharply suited lawyers and 3 senior executives from Sterling Bank's corporate headquarters. They formed a phalanx around Daniel, who stepped out of the car, his face a mask of icy composure. He straightened his tie, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the bank. The doors opened automatically as he approached. He stepped inside, the entourage following close behind. The transformation was immediate and palpable. The air crackled with tension. All eyes were on him. Sandra Hughes, David Wallace, and Marcus Johnson stood frozen, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. The other employees whispered amongst themselves. Trying to understand what was happening, Daniel stopped in the center of the lobby, his gaze sweeping across the room. He saw the fear in Sandra Hughes' eyes, the sweat beading on David Wallace's forehead, the uncertainty flickering in Marcus Johnson's face. He saw Alex Monroe, standing behind his teller window, his eyes wide with comprehension. Daniel took a deep breath and spoke, his voice resonating through the silent bank. "My name is Daniel Carter," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "And I am the newly appointed CEO of Sterling Bank." A collective gasp filled the room. The shock was almost tangible. Daniel continued, his voice gaining strength. "And as of this moment, Sandra Hughes, David Wallace, and Marcus Johnson, you are all terminated, effective immediately." The silence that followed Daniel's announcement was deafening. It was broken only by the nervous cough of one of the executives who stood behind him. Sandra Hughes looked like she'd been slapped harder than Daniel had been. Her face was a mask of fury and disbelief. David Wallace seemed to shrink in on himself, his carefully constructed facade of confidence crumbling before his eyes. Marcus Johnson's expression was unreadable, but Daniel could see a flicker of fear in his eyes. This is absurd." Sandra Hughes finally sputtered, her voice trembling with outrage. "You can't just waltz in here and fire me. I've been with this bank for 15 years. Daniel raised an eyebrow, his expression glacial. "And in those 15 years, you've apparently learned nothing about basic human decency. Your actions today were unacceptable, unprofessional, and frankly, criminal." He nodded to one of the lawyers, who stepped forward and handed Sandra Hughes a thick envelope. "Your severance package is outlined in this document. You have 30 minutes to clear out your office." Sandra Hughes snatched the envelope, her hands shaking. She glared at Daniel, her eyes filled with venom. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "You haven't heard the last of me." Daniel simply smiled, a cold, mirthless smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "I sincerely doubt that." He turned his attention to David Wallace, who was trying to blend into the background. "Mr. Wallace," Daniel said, his voice sharp. "I suggest you gather your belongings as well. Your services are no longer required." David Wallace stammered, "But Mr. Carter, there must be some misunderstanding. I was just following orders." "Following orders?" Daniel repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Is that your excuse for standing by and watching while an innocent man was assaulted? For perpetuating a culture of prejudice and discrimination? I hold you equally responsible." David Wallace paled even further. He knew he was finished. He mumbled something unintelligible and scurried away towards his office. His career in ruins. Finally, Daniel turned to Marcus Johnson. The security guard stood his ground, his face still unreadable. "Mr. Johnson," Daniel said, his voice softening slightly. "You were simply doing your job, I understand that. But you were also complicit in a terrible injustice. You acted without thinking, without questioning, without considering the consequences of your actions." He paused, studying Marcus Johnson's face. "I could have you arrested for assault. But I'm not going to. I believe you have the potential to be a better man. I'm offering you a choice." Marcus Johnson finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "What choice?" "I'm going to connect you with an organization that works with underprivileged youth," Daniel said. "They need someone with your skills and your strength. Someone who can be a positive role model. It's a chance to make amends for your past mistakes. Are you interested?" Marcus Johnson looked at Daniel for a long moment, his expression finally cracking. He nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. I'm interested," Daniel nodded back. "Good. My team will be in touch with you." He turned to the remaining employees, his voice filled with authority. "I want to assure you all that this bank is going to change. We will no longer tolerate discrimination, prejudice, or abuse of power in any form. We will create a culture of respect, fairness, and opportunity for everyone, regardless of their race. gender, or background. Those who are willing to embrace the change are welcome to stay. Those who are not, well, the door is that way. The next morning, the internet exploded. The video of Sandra Hughes slapping Daniel Carter was everywhere. It went viral within minutes, spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. Hashtag Sterling Bank Slap, hashtag CO Exposed, and hashtag Racism in Banking trended worldwide. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting the video on every major network. Pundits debated the incident, legal experts weighed in on the potential lawsuits, and civil rights activists called for a boycott of Sterling Bank. The public outcry was deafening. People were outraged by the blatant display of prejudice and abuse of power. The video became a symbol of the systemic racism that still plagued American society. Sterling Bank stock plummeted. Investors dumped their shares, fearing the long-term consequences of the scandal. The bank's reputation was in tatters. Daniel Carter watched the chaos unfold from his office at corporate headquarters. He knew that this was just the beginning. The real work was about to begin. He had assembled a team of trusted advisors, lawyers, and public relations experts to manage the crisis. They worked around the clock to control the narrative, issue statements, and reassure investors, but Daniel knew that words weren't enough. He needed to take concrete action to demonstrate his commitment to change. He announced a series of sweeping reforms, including mandatory diversity training for all employees, a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, and a commitment to hiring and promoting more people of color. He also launched a new community outreach program, investing millions of dollars in underserved neighborhoods and supporting minority-owned businesses. Amidst the turmoil, one person's career was taking an unexpected turn for the better. Alex Monroe, the young teller who had suspected something was amiss from the beginning. Daniel had been impressed by Alex's intuition and his willingness to speak out against injustice. He saw in Alex a spark of integrity and a commitment to doing the right thing. He summoned Alex to his office. "Mr. Monroe," Daniel said, "I've been watching you. I know you had your doubts about what happened with Ms. Hughes. I know you weren't comfortable with it." Alex swallowed nervously. "Yes, sir. I just felt like something wasn't right." "You were right," Daniel said. "And I appreciate your honesty. That's a rare quality these days." He paused, studying Alex's face. "I'm looking for people I can trust. People who are willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." "Are you that person, Mr. Monroe?" Alex straightened his shoulders. "Yes, sir. I am," Daniel smiled. "Good. Because I'm offering you a promotion." Alex's eyes widened in surprise. "A promotion?" "Sir, I'm just a teller." "Not for long," Daniel said. "I'm making you my assistant. I need someone who can be my eyes and ears on the ground. Someone who can tell me the truth, even when it's not what I want to hear." Alex was speechless. He couldn't believe his good fortune. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," he finally stammered. "I won't let you down," and he didn't. Alex proved to be an invaluable asset to Daniel. He was smart, hardworking, and dedicated. He quickly learned the ropes and became Daniel's most trusted advisor. Sandra Hughes, meanwhile, was experiencing a rapid and devastating downfall. After being fired, she attempted to find employment at other banks, but her reputation was ruined. No one wanted to hire someone who had become a symbol of racism and prejudice. She was ostracized by her friends and neighbors. Her name was mud. Desperate, she tried to give interviews to the press, attempting to paint herself as the victim of a political witch hunt. But no one bought it. The video of her slapping Daniel Carter was too damning. She eventually faded into obscurity, a cautionary tale of what happens when power is abused and prejudice is allowed to fester. David Wallace's fate was even worse. An internal audit, triggered by Daniel's investigation, revealed a series of shady transactions and accounting irregularities during David's tenure. He was accused of embezzlement and fraud. The FBI launched an investigation. He was arrested and charged with multiple felonies. He faced years in prison. His ambition, his greed, and his willingness to look the other way had finally caught up with him. Marcus Johnson, after his initial shock, took Daniel's offer seriously. The organization connected him with at-risk teens, kids who were heading down a similar path he had once walked. He mentored them, taught them discipline, and showed them that there was a better way to live. He used his own past mistakes as a lesson, a warning against the dangers of blindly following orders and the importance of critical thinking. He became a positive influence in their lives, a role model they could look up to. One day, he ran into Daniel at a charity event. He approached him. His face filled with gratitude. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I just wanted to thank you. You gave me a second chance. You helped me turn my life around." Daniel smiled. "You did that yourself, Marcus. I just opened the door. You were the one who walked through it." Over the next few years, Sterling Bank underwent a complete transformation. Daniel Carter implemented sweeping reforms, creating a culture of diversity, inclusion, and social responsibility. He invested in his employees, providing them with training and opportunities for advancement. He empowered them to speak out against injustice and to challenge the status quo. He rebuilt the bank's reputation, earning back the trust of investors and the public. Sterling Bank became a symbol of progress, a model for other corporations to follow. The stock price soared. The bank's profits skyrocketed. Daniel Carter became a national hero, a champion of justice and equality. Years later, Daniel Carter sat in his office, looking out over the New York skyline. He had achieved his goal. He had cleansed Sterling Bank of its rot and transformed it into a force for good in the world. He picked up a framed photograph on his desk. It was a picture of him shaking hands with Alex Monroe, who had become the bank's chief operating officer. He smiled. He knew that the fight for justice and equality was never truly over. But he had made a difference. He had shown the world that even the most powerful institutions could be changed, that even the deepest prejudices could be overcome, and it all started with a slap.